Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I've looked forward to engaging this debate, the Fisheries Act amendments that the government has brought forward. And let me begin by saying that I doubt that there is a member in this House that would not promote the protection of our environment and, more specifically, the fisheries resources that we have across Canada. We are an incredibly wealthy country when it comes to fisheries resources. We live in a beautiful country with clean streams, clean lakes, pristine oceans, and we want to protect all of our fish habitat and the fish that find their way into that habitat. And Mr. Speaker, we as Conservatives really pride ourselves on conservation. It's something that we did a really good job on when we were in government for 10 years, and we believe that being stewards of the environment is one of the things that should characterize who we are. Now, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to share with you a story. I used to be a member of City Council in Abbotsford, and of course had lots of interactions with developers, with farmers, with people who were running commercial businesses. And one day, a farmer came into my office very, very irate. And he shared with me that he had just had an altercation with a fisheries officer. Now, this farmer was on his own land, owned by him. He had actually, a couple of years earlier, dug a ditch to drain the water from his field so that he could grow crops and provide for his family, make a living off the land. And as he was on the land, clearing his ditch, a fisheries officer, with a sidearm, by the way, approached him without permission and said, "Sir, what you're doing in cleaning the ditch, you cannot do. It's going to harm fisheries, and you just cannot do that. You're going to have to make do with flooded fields." Now, you can imagine the farmer got really, really angry. That's why he had approached me and said, "What can you do?" Well, you know what? We finally passed on our concerns, as did many of my Conservative colleagues. We passed those concerns on to the Conservative government of the day. And in 2012, that government responded positively and said, there are elements of the Fisheries Act that are not reasonable. They don't reflect common sense. And one of the reasons we were having problems was with the kind of work that was being prohibited in the Fisheries Act. And it was defined as any work or undertaking that results in harmful alteration, disruption, or destruction of fish habitat. So again, harmful alteration, disruption, or disruption, which my colleague from Bruce Grey Owen Sound referred to as HAD. And that HAD standard had some very unintended consequences and side effects, especially for farmers in my riding of Abbotsford. I went to bat for them, and I know many of my Conservative colleagues went to bat for farmers in their ridings, and they delivered, because in 2012, our former Conservative government changed the legislation to delete reference to HAD. We introduced language that was more reflective of what actually happens in real life. Now, of course, these changes were made, and our Liberal friends opposed them, and our NDP friends opposed them, as they always do. And so, when the new Liberal government was elected, they decided to put the matter of fisheries protection and the 2012 changes that we had made, they put that matter to a committee of Parliament, the Fisheries Committee. And as my colleague from Bruce Grey Owen Sound articulated, that committee looked very, very carefully at the revised provisions of the Fisheries Act from 2012 to see what kind of impact they had had. And members of the committee specifically asked witnesses at that committee, what specifically can you, the witnesses, point to showing that the 2012 streamlining measures of our former Conservative government that reintroduced common sense into the Fisheries Act, could they tell the committee whether those changes had had any negative impact on fish or fish habitat. And you know what? They couldn't find anything. Not one witness before committee could point to one instance of where the streamlining of the Fisheries Act back in 2012 negatively impacted Canada's fisheries resources. So, you would ask, Mr. Speaker, well, shouldn't these decisions to again revise the Fisheries Act, reintroduce HAD, which had caused so much angst amongst farmers and others that had to do business, before you reintroduce that, wouldn't you base it on evidence and science? Well, you know what? There was no science basis for the decision to move forward with these new amendments to the Act. The committee could not show one instance of where fish and fish habitat had been harmed. This government has no evidence, no science upon which this legislation before us is based. Now, Mr. Speaker, I did my homework as well, and I actually went to our critic for fisheries, the member for North Okanagan-Shuswap, and I asked him, you know, have you discovered any information that might lead us to believe that the Liberal government actually did some checking whether there was some science attached to the changes they're bringing forward to us today? And my colleague, member for North Okanagan-Shuswap, right away said, oh yes, look at this. What we did is we submitted an order paper question to the Minister of Fisheries. And what an order paper question is, you can ask the minister any question about his or her portfolio, and they're compelled to respond. So what question did my colleague ask the Minister of Fisheries? Well, my colleague referred to the mandate letter that the Fisheries Minister had received from the Prime Minister when he was appointed the minister to see what it is that the minister had been mandated to do with respect to the Fisheries Act. And he found out that actually the government had done no work to determine whether the new provisions of this act were even necessary, to determine what impact they would have. The questions were, for example, what loss protections is the mandate letter referring to? And what harms or proof of harm to fish or fish habitat attributed to the previous Conservative government's changes to these acts exist? So is there any evidence of harm? What protections are lost or alleged to have been lost as a result of the previous government's changes to these acts are not provided for under other federal, provincial, or territorial legislation or regulation? And here's the answer that came back from the Fisheries Minister himself. The department has not been resourced or mandated to conduct this type of comprehensive monitoring and has not undertaken specific monitoring or analysis to compare the impacts of the changes to the Act. The department is, however, developing new processes. So after the fact, they're now trying to catch up. But this legislation that came forward has no science basis to it. It is intended, Mr. Speaker, to delay development in Canada. We see what's happened with the Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain Pipeline, which has created a trade war between the province of British Columbia and Alberta because there are certain individuals and governments here in Canada that do not respect the rule of law. That project went through a rigorous scientific review. And changes to the Fisheries Act that are being contemplated today in this House, presented by the Liberal government, have only one intent, and that is to slow down and stop critical development of our natural resources and critical infrastructure, which is needed across our country. So I say to the Liberals, shame on you. You claim to be the defenders and promoters of a science-based approach to governing and to legislation. And you bring forward a bill like this, which in fact does nothing of the sort. It omits a science-based approach and simply imposes an ideological one, replacing badly needed changes that our previous government had implemented and reverting back to the old system that had harmed so many businesses across Canada who had tried to build critical infrastructure, develop natural resources. That's not the way Canada is going to grow its economy. This is bad legislation, Mr. Speaker, and I hope that when this gets back to committee, the Liberal members and the NDP members of this committee understand what's at stake here and reconsider the changes that they're bringing forward to the Fisheries Act. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of International Development.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my honourable colleagues for his speech. A few years back, my daughter Candace was an Earth Rangers ambassador. She raised thousands of dollars for the Oregon spotted frog. And so in that, we see that there's a number of young people who are understanding the importance of the environment and protecting our environment, our coastal lines, etc. So I'm wondering what my honourable colleague would say to the young people in his riding and elsewhere who want to restore the protection of our fish and fish habitat, who want to ensure that we're protecting up to 10% of our coastal area by 2020, and who want to ensure that the environment and the economy go hand in hand.
The Honourable Member for Abbotsford.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. What I would say in response is the legislation we have before us is not about restoring lost protections. Those protections were never lost.
That's right.
In 2012, we brought in amendments to the Fisheries Act that streamlined the Act to make sure, as she has said, that the economy and the environment go hand in hand, which is what the Minister of Environment always preaches, but actually never delivers on, because she has never found that balance, the beautiful balance between the environment and the economy. You cannot have a healthy environment without having prosperity. You look around the world, the countries that have the highest environmental standards, are those countries that are the most prosperous in the world. The two go hand in hand. And when you introduce legislation like that before us, what you're doing is undermining Canada's ability to build infrastructure, to build pipelines, develop resources. You're undermining our long-term prosperity as a country.
Comments. The Honourable Member for Port Moody, Coquitlam.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate my colleague's intervention and his comments. The member of Abbotsford painted quite a picture of the reason for the 2012 changes. He talked about farmers' drainage ditches. He spoke about that being the reason for the gutting of the Fisheries Act in 2012. I remember it quite differently. My understanding of the real reason behind the changes was to do with Prime Minister Harper's concern about the Fisheries Act causing a problem for the oil agenda that he had, which was getting those pipelines to Tidewater. So what did they do? They went specifically after a specific section within the Act which was habitat protection, and they removed that completely, the habitat protection, and they switched the focus of the Act to serious harm of certain fish, commercial fish, making it practically impossible to prove that any project would have an impact on the fish or fishery. In fact, that caused the absolute opposite of what he was hoping for, which was certainty for business and industry. It started to cause uncertainty. And that, when you had 600 scientists speak out, 2 former Conservative fisheries ministers spoke out, John Fraser and Tom Siddon. So I asked my colleague, what would he say to John Fraser and Tom Siddon about their concerns about the changes in 2012?
The Honourable Member for Abbotsford.
You know what I would say to them, and what I would say to that member, who I do respect, is that his suggestion that we gutted the Fisheries Act is not borne out by evidence. In my earlier comments, I mentioned that the Fisheries Committee actually studied the changes we made to the Fisheries Act and specifically asked the question, Mr. Speaker, is there any evidence from any of the witnesses that in fact the changes that were made to the Fisheries Act to make it more responsive to the needs of the Canadian economy, while at the same time protecting our fish and fish habitat, was there any indication those aims were harmed, that fish habitat was at risk? There was not one piece of evidence brought forward at committee. I'm an evidence-based guy, Mr. Speaker. I'm a lawyer. Going into the law courts, into a courtroom, you're always talking about evidence. I believe in science. I believe in evidence. That evidence could have been presented at committee. Any of the members of that committee representing all the parties in this House had the opportunity to ask the question, did those changes that our former Conservative government make harm fish or fish habitat? And not one person came forward. So the suggestion that the Fisheries Act was gutted in 2012 is patently false.
Resuming debate, the honourable